Hey guys, I want to do a video blog this week so I can talk about a topic that is kind of complicated, but I think once you understand the basic premise, that it can help you a lot with assessing progress and I think even optimizing performance in the gym as you're trying to lean out. And that would be how our carbohydrate intake is going to affect not only our performance in the gym, but affect the number on the scale, and how the difference between body composition and body weight changes are not a one-to-one. They're not the same thing. And so in terms of like gaining muscle mass or performance, these still hold true, but in terms of fat loss, I think it's really important because people are so focused with the scale number that they can often miss the forest for the trees and end up kind of in this cyclical dieting process where they're really missing the point of what's happening, and it keeps them trapped in this low carb to high carb, low carb to high carb cycle that goes on for months or years, which lots of people do. So I'll say off the bat for a caveat that unless someone absolutely needs, or they really, really want a low carb diet or a ketogenic diet, I try to keep their carbohydrates as high as possible during the fat loss phase because they are so crucial for performance. And now I know if you do a ketogenic diet, once you go through the adaptation phase, and the true adaptation phase can be 3 months, even 6 months in some athletes, and that's a long time to devote, your energy to something that really in the research shows that it's keto at its best for a lot of athletes is only as good as eating plenty of carbohydrates. And so that's a lot of extra work, and it's a lot of extra time, and a lot of extra sucky training and feeling like crap to go through this long adaptation period that in the end only gets you the same performance that you had before. So there are some instances where people need keto or need a very low carb diet, maybe PCOS, or something like that. But for the average person looking to lean out, even someone who's overweight, they can still eat carbohydrates, and losing that body fat, losing that body weight is going to improve their insulin sensitivity. So I won't slash someone's carbohydrates unless they, for some reason, really want me to, or they, for some reason, I feel that they need to. For most people, I'm not going to do that. So what's one of the main reasons? Well, if you're weight training and you're doing a lot of glycolytic activity, that's what weight training is, you're burning through mostly glycogen. Now, you are burning through fatty acids and things like that between sets when you're aerobic, but for most of your weight training activity, that is very glycolytic. So if the weight training that you're doing is what's helping you build muscle mass and gain insulin sensitivity and help with your longevity and bone density and all those things, why prematurely cut the fuel source that is fueling that activity? Why shoot yourself in the foot for performance when you don't have to? If all you need to do is keep protein high and create a calorie deficit, why cut it all from carbohydrates when you have so much to lose in terms of performance and how you feel? And I would argue that for most people, it's not worth it. So in terms of keeping carbs higher, I think this could be a good case for why you'd want to do that. And of course, one of the reasons most people choose between fat and carbs when they're creating a deficit is because the research is pretty clear in weight-trained populations, somewhere between 1.8 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of protein for body weight is optimal for most people. It's 0.8 to 1 gram per pound. If you're leaning out, it's even a little bit higher. Jose Antonio's done research where they do 4.4 grams per kilogram. No one's going that high, but you could, and there's no adverse health effects even after a year. So there's a lot of evidence for why keeping protein high is optimal for health and especially during fat loss. So you're going to create your deficit from carbohydrates or fat. And of course, if you're creating a calorie deficit, both of those numbers are going to go down. But there's no reason to focus all on one, the carbs, and keep fat really, really high when you're doing activity that relies on those carbs. And if losing weight is really the thing that's going to put your health back in order, then you could do that through a combination calorie deficit, fat, and carbs. For most people, insulin resistance is a product of having too much fat mass on their body. It's not from eating too many carbohydrates. You may have gained a lot of body fat from overeating fat and carbohydrates, but the insulin resistance and those other metabolic effects, negative metabolic effects, are really coming from having too much body fat. And the evidence is even shown in literature. If you want to induce insulin resistance, you can give people a high-fat diet. A really high-fat single feeding can cause some temporary insulin resistance. So you don't have to overeat carbohydrates for insulin resistance. You just got to gain a bunch of body fat. So having said that, here's a reason why I would caution against cutting your carbs low and how that would affect the scale weight. And this example I'm going to give you is purely hypothetical. I could see it happening to tons of people everywhere, especially since the calorie numbers aren't that crazy and some of these effects are going to happen in your body. But I chose these numbers just because I think it helps a clearer understanding. The numbers work for my example. I'm not saying that this is going to happen in this ratio for everyone, but the numbers will work for this example. And obviously this is going to happen to some degree when you're in a calorie deficit and you're cutting carbs really low. So let's cover the basics. You've heard the rule, the old adage, there's 3,500 calories in a pound of fat. If you want to lose a pound a week, you would eat a 500 calorie deficit every day, times 7 days in a week is 3,500 calories. Hopefully that's going to result in a pound lost every week. But let's say you want to be a little bit more aggressive and you go, 500 calories isn't good enough for me. I've been eating way too much. I want to punish myself a little bit. Let's do a 700 calorie deficit. And I chose this number because it helps to illustrate what I'm going to point out. Let's hold true that if you do a 700 calorie deficit every day, that 500 of those calories is coming purely from fat. And the reason that the fat loss is pretty linear on the scale is because fat tissue is about 90% lipid and only about 10% water. So most of your fat cells are filled with fat tissue. So you're not going to get a huge variance on the scale weight from losing fat. It'll be pretty linear. So let's say out of that 700 calories, 500 is fat, and the other 200, because you're in a calorie deficit and you're eating a lower carb diet, that 200 calorie leftover is going to be burning through glycogen. You're not eating as many carbs, you're not restoring glycogen as much. So over time, your glycogen stores in your muscles are going to go down. You have way more calories stored on your body in terms of fat tissue than you do glycogen. The average person, somewhere between 500 to 700 grams of glycogen stored in their muscles, about 100 grams stored in their liver. That's a few thousand calories of stored glycogen. You have tens of thousands of calories of stored tens of thousands of stored calories in body fat on you. So you're going to burn through that glycogen a lot faster than you're going to burn through that body fat. But for this example, out of that 700 calories, 500 is coming from fat, which is going to predict a pound of fat loss per week. 200 of those calories every day is going to come from glycogen. What does that predict in terms of weight loss? So stick with me here on the math. I have my notes here, and they have been checked 3 times. So I'm pretty confident in all of this. I'm very confident in all of this. Working out to show you just exactly how this could impact your weight. So we've got that 500 calories a day from fat times 7 is 3,500 calories. That's 1 pound of fat for the week. Great. I'm going to circle that. We're done with that. 200 calories every day from glycogen. Well, there are 4 calories per gram of glycogen, so that 200 calories of glycogen is 50 grams daily that you're burning through, which is pretty reasonable. Times 7 days a week is 350 grams of glycogen that you've burned through during the week on top of that pound of fat you burned through. Okay, so we're burning the fat, but we're also burning through that glycogen. Now, for 350 grams, there's 28 grams in an ounce. That's about 12 ounces in weight of glycogen you've lost during the week. Now hold on to your seat, because you may not realize this, but for every gram of glycogen that you store about 3 to 4 grams of water. Now I'm going to go on the low end and say for this example, you're storing 3 grams of water for every gram of glycogen. So I'm even lowballing it. So that 12 ounces of glycogen weight lost, you'd also lose 36 ounces of water along with it, for a total for the week of 48 ounces of weight lost from glycogen and water alone. 48 ounces is 3 pounds. So collectively for the week, you've lost 4 pounds. 25% of that was pure fat, 75% of that was glycogen and water. Can you see where I'm going with this? You created a deficit where you're burning through stored energy. Fat tissue is stored energy, glycogen is stored energy. But you have so much more body fat on you, and the glycogen stores are very low, and you're going to burn through them quickly because it's not just the calorie deficit, it's the very low carbs. So as you're doing activity that is fueled from those carbs, you're going to be tapping into your stores daily and lowering them over time. So you may be over the moon that first week. I lost 4 pounds. It's awesome, but only 25% of that is fat. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with that. A pound a week of fat loss is awesome. But if you're expecting 4 pounds, then you're going to be mistaken, especially as over the next few weeks, your glycogen stores kind of normalize. And I say normalize, basically they match what you're burning with what you're eating. So you don't see those large changes in glycogen and water storage as the weeks progress. You're going to see the scale weight slow, but the fat loss may not be stalling. So what if after 4 weeks the first week, 4 pounds the first week, 3 pounds the second, 2 pounds the third, and then 1 pound the fourth week? You may be losing a pound of fat every single week. You're just losing less glycogen and water weight as those weeks go by. But the whole time you're thinking, I'm actually doing worse because I'm losing less and less weight on the scale as the weeks progress. So you need to understand that if you're choosing to do something like a low-carb diet, you're going to see those really inspiring and kind of a good for buy-in weight changes on the scale, but it's not all fat. And the reason I can prove that it's not all fat is because if you lost 4 pounds of fat in 1 week, purely 4 pounds of fat, if there's 3,500 calories in every pound of fat, 4 pounds is 14,000 calories. So if you were in a 14,000 calorie deficit for the week, divided by 7 days, that's a 2,000 calorie deficit every single day. For most people, eating 2,000 to 3,000 calories a day, I mean, there's no way you're going to be creating a 2,000 calorie deficit every day from fat, unless you just didn't eat at all, and in which case you would still lose some from glycogen and water weight too. So since you're probably eating at a 500 to 700 calorie deficit like I showed here, you can't argue that all that weight is fat mass. And so on top of that, that's fine if you want to do that, but you need to understand where the weight is coming from, and over time the weight changes aren't going to be as exciting, even though the fat loss changes may be the same. You're just not going to see the glycogen and water weight changes. So that's fine if you want to go down that road, and if you understand it and you go, I get it. Once I kind of find a linear process in weight loss every week, I can know that's probably coming mostly from fat, and then I can adjust the numbers based off of that. That's totally cool. Do that. I have no problem with that. But if you have a high training output, let's say you're working like I do on your feet all day in the kitchen, and then your weight training on top of that, what if you're someone who goes hiking with your dog? What if you're doing a sport on the side or a weekend, some pickup games of basketball or something, and your glycogen demands are much, much higher? Your performance all around is going to go down, and you're not going to feel that good. I mean, you need 180 to 110, 120 grams of glucose per day just for your brain. I mean, if you carry a lot of muscle mass, or even just an average amount, and you're doing all that glycolytic activity, it's really going to impair your performance. And of course, you can aerobically, fuel your cells from fat, and you can make more glycogen through gluconeogenesis, which the liver does. But it's a slower and it's a more expensive process. If you're turning your protein into glycogen through gluconeogenesis, you're basically making expensive glycogen. Why take your steak and turn it into glycogen when you could have a sweet potato and turn it into glycogen. One is much cheaper and it's much more efficient. I don't see a reason that people need to cut it really low. And if you want to, that's different than feeling like you need to. And if it's the insulin argument, well, insulin does a lot more than shuttle carbohydrates in the muscle. In fasted states, you don't even need insulin for this small amount of glucose that's floating along the bloodstream to get into cells. So you have to have like a tenfold increase in fasting blood glucose levels before insulin is high enough for it to start shuttling nutrients into cells. So, I mean, insulin is also a satiety hormone, and ultimately, if since we know from the research that simply having insulin high does not cause insulin resistance, that you can't point to that as the boogeyman. Protein stimulates insulin too. No one's arguing that protein makes you fat, and you don't need insulin to store dietary fat as body fat. There's an enzyme called ASP that does that just fine. So there's a lot of mechanisms where you can get insulin resistant and you can gain a lot of body fat without having chronically high insulin levels. And if you've done a long-term low carb or long-term ketogenic diet, you're more insulin resistant at the end of it than you were at the beginning because you're not using insulin. So the whole argument for that increasing insulin sensitivity is bunk. If you do lose weight, you will increase your insulin sensitivity. So you could point and say, well, I ate lower carb and I ate lower calorie and I lost weight, and now I'm more insulin sensitive, I guess if you want to do an oral glucose tolerance test. But really the insulin sensitivity would come through your decreased fat mass, not from lowering the carbohydrates. So there's a lot of things you could try to blame it on, but I think ultimately you just need to pick your poison, so to speak, when you're creating a deficit, and just understand if you're looking for those huge weight changes on the scale, if that's what's really motivating to you, if that's the only thing you care about, I feel like you may end up getting stuck in a cycle of doing low carb and then binging and then low carb and then binging because you're addicted to seeing those large changes on the scale. And I would rather have someone have really, really productive training, feel good, not feeling deprived, not feeling like they can't ever have some rice or some oatmeal or, God forbid, even a piece of bread or something like that, and still lean out. The calorie deficit is really what's going to determine the rate of fat loss. And I think for most people who, at the end of a diet, you're going to have to go back to eating somewhat normally, right? You're going to eat a mix of protein and carbs and fats. And so your carbs are going to come up, right? No one's going to do a ketogenic diet for the rest of their life. I don't say no one, but most people. Most people won't even do a really low carb diet for the rest of their life. So at some point, you're going to have to find a middle ground. And if every time you go back to a maintenance diet, you're obsessed with the scale changing because of the subsequent glycogen and water weight increases, I feel like it's really setting you up for failure and for a lot of kind of inner turmoil that is totally unnecessary. And I hope that over time the whole, insulin, the insulin as the boogeyman of fat gain has pretty much been debunked, but getting it across to people is a different matter. And so hopefully showing something like this can show you that you can lose weight just fine, creating a deficit through carbohydrates and fats. And if you choose to do the low carb route, you're going to see some larger changes on the scale, but it's probably not what you think. And you need to be prepared for how that impacts your performance and also how that impacts the scale when you add those carbs back in.